Center for Disaster Philanthropy webinar, Hurricane Harvey Recovery, How Donors Can Help. Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Ottenhoff, President and CEO of CDP, and we want to thank you so much for joining us today. Hurricane Harvey was the largest storm to make landfall in the U.S. in more than a decade. It has since been downgraded to a tropical storm and is continuing to dump rain across a large part of Texas and parts of Louisiana. This storm is the largest disaster event the U.S. has faced in years, and it will be weeks before we know the true outcome of damages caused by Harvey. To update us on relief work in the affected areas and to learn what funders can do to help, we've gathered a panel of experts to help us out. First, and we're not sure he's going to be able to make it, this is Damian Morales. He's the Disaster Services Program Manager at the One Star Foundation, which is the State Service Commission for Texas. Damian is also the chair of Central Texas Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters, or VOAD. He's the secretary of Texas VOAD and the secretary of the National VOAD Volunteer Management Committee. Now, Damian is at the State Operations Center in Austin, Texas. We had hoped he could join us, but it is a very busy place and he has a complicated schedule. So we'll wait to see if he can join us or not later in this webinar. We're also pleased to be joined by Michael Riedy, who is a voluntary agency liaison, or VAL, with FEMA. He's currently deployed to Texas. VALs work to build relationships between federal, state, and tribal governments and community-based, faith-based organizations and voluntary agencies. He has served in several capacities previously with FEMA in numerous disasters, including the Joplin tornado, Hurricane Irene, Superstorm Sandy, Louisiana floods, and many others. Also, we're pleased to be joined by Renée Wizig-Barrios, who's the Senior Vice President and Chief Philanthropy Officer with the Greater Houston Community Foundation. She leads the foundation's efforts to provide its donors with opportunities to participate in high engagement, high impact philanthropy. She joined the foundation in 2010 after serving as lead organizer for the Metropolitan Organization and brings more than 20 years of experience in the nonprofit sector to her role. And then finally, we're pleased to have Jeanne-Aimee, who's the Senior Director of Domestic Preparedness at Save the Children and is leading Save the Children's Hurricane Harvey response. She has led responses to both natural and man-made disasters throughout the U.S. and is a national expert in child care, emergency preparedness, response, and recovery, and in the protection of children in emergencies. Since Hurricane Katrina in 2005, she has led the Save the Children's response to every major disaster in the United States, including Hurricane Rita, the Joplin tornadoes, and Superstorm Sandy. And we're so grateful she was able to join us at such short notice. So before we get started, I'd now like to turn to Paula Wolferseder Yabar, who's the Senior Vice President of Member Relations and Development at the Council on Foundations. Paula, welcome.
Thank you, Bob. And I'll make this short, as I know we want to hear from all of the speakers who are on the ground in the thick of this disaster. The Council on Foundations is pleased to co-host this call with the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, and the partnership between our two organizations, especially during times like these, is critical for the sector. Our hearts go out to all the families who have been affected by Hurricane Harvey. The film clips and photos, I am sure, do not come close to the actual devastation on the ground. We've been hearing from our council members who have told us that it is much worse than what we are seeing on TV or social feeds. I want to point out the resources to guide philanthropic giving that we have on our website, which we will continue to update, as well as the close relationship we have with our philanthropic liaisons at FEMA and across other branches of the government. I look forward to listening to our experts and to tell us what's happening on the ground and how we can help. Thanks, Bob.
Paula, thank you so much for those comments, and thanks to all of our friends at the Council on Foundations for being such great partners. So now, this being a live webinar, we're going to see if Damian Morales has been able to stay with us. Damian, are you there?
Hey, Bob, I'm still here. Thank you.
Oh,
And apologies in advance for the background noise. As Bob has referenced, I'm currently staffing the State Operations Center here in Austin, Texas, on behalf of Texas Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. And we're expecting a special guest here in the State Operations Center momentarily. So apologies in advance if I have to drop off the call without notice. As Bob had referenced and alluded to, this is a catastrophic event. Many of our communities throughout the state of Texas are experiencing record level flooding. Right now, a lot of the media attention is on the greater Houston area. However, we also had a Category 4 hurricane impact numerous communities within Southeast Texas. In addition to that, we had multiple communities within Central Texas experience record level flooding as well. What complicates matters even more is we've had about 7 federally declared disasters in Texas within the past 3 years. Many of the communities being most impacted by Harvey have also been impacted numerous times over the past 3 years. Many of these communities were in recovery from prior devastating flooding events, and they're being re-impacted again, which is to say that we are struggling in terms of resourcing these communities. We were struggling prior to Hurricane Harvey to provide recovery funds to some of these communities, and the struggle at post-Harvey will be of a magnitude that I've never seen before in my career, and I don't believe that Texas has seen. That being said, in terms of activities of our voluntary organizations active in disaster, we have local partners, state partners, and national partners providing mass care support throughout the state. The state has opened several mega shelters. We expect our shelter populations to rise pretty significantly over the coming days and weeks as folks that are not currently unable to be evacuated from the most inundated areas begin to be evacuated to our mega shelter locations. The primary locations for those right now are in the greater Dallas area, Houston, Austin may be opening one up as well. There's talk of opening one potentially in El Paso and other communities throughout the state. In terms of what funders can do to help support relief efforts, it's important to remember that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Before we get to that, Dave,
Sure.
Tell me what goes on in the State Operations Center?
So the State Operations Center is staffed by representatives from each of the state agencies, as well as Texas VOAD, the American Red Cross, the Salvation Army, as well as national partners such as the National Guard, FEMA, and a variety of other state and federal agencies. We're all working collaboratively to ensure that life safety remains a priority and that we're able to provide mass care support to those in need. As I alluded to earlier, search and rescue operations are ongoing. Those are being coordinated at the local level as well as through the State Operations Center. And then in terms of the mass care functions, shelters, feeding, those types of operations, they're being operated collaboratively between our federal, state, local, and nonprofit partners.
So how are your VOAD members doing? I mean, you're all first responders. What's it been like for you, and have your member facilities been affected by this disaster?
Sure, Bob, thank you. So this is a very unique event in terms of the duration of the storm. Typically what we've seen here in Texas, which is the state that I could speak to most, is an event will occur and it'll have a definite end date, so to speak, after which we'll be able to get into those communities, do damage assessments, and begin the long process of short-term and long-term recovery. With this event, we have communities that are still being inundated. So in some of our communities, like you've seen on the news in Greater Houston, we have swift water rescues and things of that nature still going on. In other communities, like here in Central Texas, near Greater Austin, where I'm located currently, we have communities that are beginning the process of recovery. So we're really in response in most of the state, but also at the very beginning stages of short-term recovery in others. Our VOAD partners from the national level have begun to deploy and pre-deploy assets within the state through working with Mike and his team over at FEMA and our state voluntary agency liaison here at the Texas Division of Emergency Management, we're really coordinating efforts and trying to work in the most collaborative fashion that we can to ensure that we're providing the resources that our communities need over the days, weeks, months, and frankly, years ahead.
Damon, I know we're going to lose you in just a minute, so maybe you can just say a word about what can donors be doing right now to support the work of the VOAD in Texas.
Sure, Bob. So I am fielding hundreds, if not thousands, of phone calls and emails from private sector partners, from foundations such as those on this call, from private citizens who are expressing their desire to help. Right now, the key messaging we're trying to send out is make a financial contribution to a voluntary agency of your choice. You can visit nationalvoad.org and or texasvoad.org for a list of those organizations. In addition, I really implore the folks on this call to remember that this is a marathon, not a sprint. As we've experienced here in Texas over the past couple of years, while a lot of the resources come into our communities quickly for the response phase, where the funding is truly needed is the years ahead, where we don't have as much media coverage, and where our communities they don't have the resources, they don't have the assistance that's needed to help our communities recover. So it's important to remember that this is a marathon. Recovery from this event will last years. I know there's a lot of pressure a lot of the time from the public and from others to spend the money quickly. However, we really need to work collaboratively between funders, voluntary organizations, local governmental partners to ensure that we're being strategic in terms of how we're raising funds, as well as how we're sending those funds out and spending those funds in our communities. So if there's one point I can leave folks on this call with, it's remember this is a marathon, not a sprint. Funding is going to be needed in most of these communities for years, not days, not months, but years.
Thank you, Damon. Thank you to you and to all your colleagues who are doing such spectacular, difficult work for us. If you could stay on the line, go on mute for now, and hopefully we can come back and ask you some more questions, but I want to bring some of our other panelists into this discussion for right now.
Sure thing. Thanks, Bob.
Okay, Michael Riedy, let's go on to you. You're a voluntary agency liaison, or VAL, with FEMA. So you're down there in Texas, and you've done this all over the country many, many times. Have you ever experienced anything like this disaster?
So, hey, thanks for having me, Bob. I really appreciate being able to speak to your funders and provide some technical assistance on this. This is a catastrophic event for sure. I've worked Superstorm Sandy, and I was actually last year. I was in August in Baton Rouge supporting their 1,000-year flood event. This looks to be significantly larger than that flood, and that flood was pretty bad. And we're looking at large numbers. The projections for registrations for individual assistance are looking at around 500,000, 450,000 applicants is the projection at this point, and that may actually be more. We're so far, the registrations actually for folks that have registered, we're at 62,625 as of last night. And we also, I mean, this is just, it's huge, and it's fast moving, and we are not even into recovery really. We are still doing response. We have,
so you're saying that there have been 62,000 individuals who have already applied for FEMA assistance, but you expect 62,000 families. 62,000 families, but you expect as many as upwards of 500,000 families.
Yes. So just to put that in perspective, the August 2016 flood had 150,000 applicants. So we're looking at 3 times that at least for this disaster. So significant, very significant. And go ahead.
And when a family asks for assistance, what can they expect to get from FEMA?
So that's a good question. You know, families that own their land, or own the property, they could potentially be eligible for repairs, replacement, and then depending on how much money they make, they may be eligible also for contents. Renters may be also eligible for contents. that really depends on the amount of money they make when we're talking about contents. But typically, any family that registers with FEMA assistance, if they have damages that are associated with this hurricane and tropical storm flooding, they may be eligible for individual assistance. And it's important to understand that not everybody is going to get the max grant. Most people will get the average grant award is about $3,000 nationally. The max grant that any family could make to receive from FEMA is $33,300 for this disaster. So for what we consider the unmet needs, when we look at 10% of the total applicants typically have an unmet need. So if we're looking at 450,000, we're expecting somewhere around 45 to 50,000 families that are going to have unmet needs after they go through FEMA and Small Business Administration. To also put things in perspective, we just turned on transitional sheltering assistance, where we put families directly into hotels and we pay for their lodging. And so far, we actually have families in 333 hotels. That's 1,274 rooms, so approximately 4,000 families that are staying in those hotels. And Damien let you know that we have many shelters that are stood up, some that are being run by the Red Cross and other organizations, and some that are spontaneously popping up. We have 142 shelters that are currently open as of last night, with a total population of 22,000. So, and we expect that number to rise significantly.
So I saw something in the newspaper this morning that said there were more than 30,000 people in emergency shelters. So what you're saying is it's a combination, right, of both FEMA shelters as well as nonprofit shelters that are taking care of this.
Yeah, so it's Red Cross shelters, American Red Cross shelters, and other, faith-based and other spontaneous shelters. I saw in the news this morning there was a furniture store that opened up their store as a shelter. So anybody, a lot of different folks are doing shelters all across the state.
So, Mike, give us an idea of the next week or so. What will FEMA be focusing on, and then
go ahead.
And then what's the next phase after that?
Yeah, so actually, very good question. Typically at this point we are bringing in a whole bunch of folks, and we're starting to send people out in the field, including our disaster survivor assistance teams and instructors that are going to go to houses. Unfortunately, a lot of the areas are still inundated with significant water, so it's still dangerous for us to go into those areas. And so it's going to be, a slow move into recovery. I mean, like I said, we still have search and rescue operations. Last night they were very active in different parts between Houston and Galveston. So. And the other piece is that Tropical Storm Harvey is expected to remake landfall between now and tomorrow morning along the Texas Louisiana coast, and also expected to bring another 1 to 3 feet of storm surge for the coastal area of Louisiana as well. So this is not over, and we're still seeing more waters coming in, and there's a couple dams that are pretty high, so we're keeping an eye out on that, but we're making sure safety is paramount for all of us. We don't want to put more people in harm's way, and Damien is in the state Val and the Texas Vote have made it very clear that volunteers, please do not go now, to hold back if you're not doing response activities, because you would just get in the way, and it's still pretty dangerous.
That's such an important thing to say, and that's what we've been saying as well at CDP, is that now is not the time to be donating products or be volunteering. It's just too much chaos right now on the ground. But Mike, one of the things that donors are often confused about is what services does FEMA provide and what services are provided by voluntary organizations. And so I know it's not a bright line, but can you give us some guidance about where the responsibilities lie?
Sure, thank you. So, typically what we have the VALs, the Voluntary Agency Liaisons, we have what we call the sequence of delivery to kind of highlight those kinds of activities, what that looks like for a survivor when we turn on individual assistance, And typically what you look at first is, you'll always have the volunteer organizations that are active with or without a state or federal presence, You could have a large apartment fire where you have the Salvation Army, Red Cross, and other organizations that are providing, gas cards are providing new clothes, they're getting them a hotel or food, a warm meal, a blanket, those things, and those happen with or without a state or federal presence. Our volunteer partners are so important in disasters, and we recognize that. But even in a catastrophic event, they are there in the beginning, and they are helping out. And sometimes it takes the state and feds, especially FEMA, to get turned on. And so once we are active, there is a process, from the volunteer organizations providing some immediate relief, and then when FEMA turns on to individual assistance, folks need to register with FEMA. Calling the 800-621-3362. Or 800 FEMA is the last four for that, or going to disasterassistance.gov to register. And like I said earlier, folks that register that are homeowners or renters may be eligible for some kind of assistance, potentially including rental assistance. If they have damage to their home, if they're an owner, they can also get hopefully some help for repairs. And folks that have other medical, dental, funeral expenses, they may also be eligible for some other assistance as well. And then if families make so much money above the poverty level, they need to also apply for Small Business Administration disaster loans in order to receive any more assistance. Because if you can make a certain amount of money, then you need to support yourself, and you need to apply for an SBA loan. And so folks that make above a certain amount of money have to apply to SBA for more assistance. Others that are below the poverty line automatically get referred back to FEMA for what we call other needs assistance, where we can help out with contents, potentially helping with repairs of a vehicle that got flooded, and some other things. But again, I wanted to let you all know that our max grant for FEMA assistance is $33,300. So the majority of folks are going to be made whole through the FEMA and SBA process, but we are very concerned about that 10%. That 10% is those people are not going to be made whole by our process, and that's why at the end of the whole process, it's important that we have folks do disaster case management through the long-term recovery groups that are stood up in these different counties that are impacted, and then that we facilitate a discussion about unmet needs and a way to bring in voluntary partners to do rebuilds. And that's really where the rubber meets the road. That's where we hope that funders see where they can help out the most, is we can take dollars through the long-term recovery groups and working through the volunteer partners and have relationships with building box stores like your Lowe's, Home Depot, Lumber 84, McLendon, Menards. I don't know the other names of the ones down here, but they have those relationships with all those lumber companies, and they can get reduced costs, building materials, and they can maximize the recovery of those families that are going to be having unmet needs to help them find their new normal in the post-disaster. And you heard Damien say before that we've had several federal declarations over the last 3 years in Texas, and of course Louisiana just got hit. So there's a lot of fatigue, both donor fatigue and volunteer fatigue. So it's definitely gonna be a huge disaster recovery. We have what we call the number of 10. So if you had 10 days of recovery, 10 days of response, the immediate recovery is usually 10 times that, so 100 days. And then you talk about the long-term recovery is 10 times that, so you're talking about 1,000 days. So if it was a 10-day of response, you're talking about a 3.5-year long-term recovery piece. And this one, we're still in response. So you can imagine this is going to take a long time for us to get into that to complete a recovery. And you've seen the story here. This may not be the last one. So it's important that all work together, and we're coordinating on all the different pieces, and especially that long-term recovery piece, because FEMA will not make you whole for that 10 to 15, I'd say 10% of those folks. You know, it's important that we understand that, and really, really good if we can work with Damien's group, the Texas VOAD, and all the long-term recovery groups that are going to stand up on this disaster across the East Texas area. Did I lose you? Hello?
Hi, this is Jeanne-Aimee with SAVE. I'm still here. I don't know about the host.
This is
Renee. I'm still here too.
Okay, good. I thought I lost everybody.
Anna, jump on, please.
Okay, so we have apparently temporarily lost Bob, so I'm going to go over to Renee and ask Renee to talk a little bit about what has been going on at the Greater Houston Community Foundation and what you guys have been working on over the last few days since the storm approached your area.
Thank you. And first, I'd just like to say our hearts are very full of concern for our entire community. We really still feel like we're absolutely in the midst of this disaster. We have employees who have been evacuated, one who had to swim today to a relative's house. So this is something that we are really feeling quite close to home. All of us have friends, neighbors, and family members who've been severely impacted. And at the same time, we're extremely grateful for all of the incredible interest and compassion that we're seeing, both from neighbors locally and from people all over the world who are reaching out and wanting to make a difference. And so certainly in this time of really incredible disaster, we appreciate the interest of everyone, and also really appreciate the hard work that our team is trying to do to respond.
Okay, I will dial back in again. Okay.
Sorry. Okay. So at the Community Foundation, what we've been focused on is trying to help on several different levels. First of all, we are administering the Hurricane Harvey Relief Fund for Mayor Sylvester Turner and County Judge Ed Emmett. That's going to be a city-county relief fund, which is focusing on both short and long-term needs, and we'll have a local advisory committee that's very close to the needs of the community that will be making the recommendations for how distributions and grants will be made for both immediate needs, short and long-term needs. So certainly we've been extremely busy with that process and making sure that everyone can give who wants to, and also just fielding interest from all over the country. We certainly have a lot of donors locally and nationally who are trying to see if they can organize fundraisers of all different kinds to benefit relief funding, whether it's the Hurricane Harvey Relief Fund or the United Way Fund or the Red Cross or any of the many wonderful agencies that are working in this space. So certainly we're hearing from a lot of donors wanting to raise funds. We're hearing from a lot of our companies who are both locally and nationally present who have employees who have been impacted by the disaster. So we're standing up a number of corporate disaster relief funds where employees will be able to apply for assistance from their companies and get some disaster relief grants. For those of you who aren't quite aware of that process, when there has been a federally declared disaster, a company can set up a disaster relief fund. These are often set up with local community foundations, and we're able to put in a process of application so that the employee can apply to receive assistance for lost car, damage to their home, other experiences that help supplement their unmet needs. So we're certainly working on all of that. And just also, obviously, we're reaching out to our own donors, as we have many people who've been impacted, and to the rest of our foundation community to see how we can collaborate together to address immediate and long-term needs.
Renee, hi. This is Bob. I'm back again.
Great.
This is a live webinar. Have the foundations in Texas begun working together, and do you have a kind of a coordinated, collaborative strategy that you're beginning to think about?
We have not yet. We have begun to hear from other foundations. We've certainly had outreach from other community foundations who are interested in looking at ways that we might collaborate for long-term recovery. And we have had outreach. But we've also had outreach from community foundations all over the United States, our colleagues who are wanting to help. And we've had some local foundations beginning to reach out, quite honestly, because we're still very much in the midst of the disaster in the greater Houston area and all across Texas. I'm not sure that people have yet had the time to do that, but I certainly know that we have, a very collaborative funding community here locally, and I feel like we have a collaborative one statewide as well. So I would expect that we will be in conversation with each other about how we can best do that. But this conversation have not begun in earnest yet, to my knowledge.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. Well, I want to remind our listeners that if you have a question for our panelists, you can respond. You can do so by clicking the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and then we'll be sure to get to your question as soon as possible. Before we get to your questions, we want to bring in our fourth panelist, and I apologize if I mispronounce your name, Jeanne-Aimee Marrais. Is that right?
Sure. My name is Jeanne-Aimee Marrais.
Okay, you can tell. You can tell. No French is not my first language, nor is English. Sometimes I think. So, and you're the Senior Director of Domestic Preparedness at Save the Children, and you've been so active in disasters around the country. Have you seen anything like this disaster here in Texas?
Yes, well, I was Save the Children's team leader for Hurricane Katrina for 16 months on the Gulf Coast, and then have responded numerous times in Texas to Hurricane Ike, which was also a catastrophic event in the Houston area. But there's no question that this is turning into an absolutely massive, perhaps the largest of the responses certainly in recent history, if not potentially in the U.S. history. So we are currently, I have been working since before the storm in shelters in San Antonio, in Victoria, and then we also down in the Corpus area. And we're continuing to, Save the Children is continuing to support work for children in the shelters in the San Antonio area. And then today we were up in Austin providing support to those shelters. I'm actually about halfway across on my way to Houston right now to the George R. Brown mega shelter, which is the one that's reported to have had, I think they have beds for 5,000 people, and they had about 10,000 people overnight. We know from the past, I had worked at this George R. Brown Center during Hurricane Ike. It is a very difficult environment, very risky for children who are there. In each of the shelters that we've gone into, children comprise about 30 to 40% of the population. And just to give you a couple of stories. So the first shelter that we went into in San Antonio, the head of the medical services, there's a nursing station at that shelter, came up to me very quickly and was like, oh, thank God. They see the name Save the Children, and they're like, thank God you're here. They had more than 20 infants and toddlers sleeping in cardboard boxes for the first couple of nights because there were no supplies and equipment to support little children. And one of the things that Save the Children does is to bring in pop-up cribs and sheets, bring in infant hygiene tubs so that little babies can be washed and bathed to support their very basic health needs, as well as we bring in pop-up strollers, which can be used not only to hold children, but also as temporary high chairs so that you're able to feed very young children when they're in shelters in these high chairs. So our very first effort in shelters is to bring in supplies that support infants and toddlers. Then the second thing that we work on is to set up care programs for children so that while they're there, they're safer environments. And we have 2 of these care programs up and operational in San Antonio. And it's our intention as soon as we, hopefully, knock on wood, I'll be able to get all the way to George R. Brown tonight. But we intend to start setting up programs there and in the new mega shelter in Dallas, likely tomorrow, and definitely by, knock on wood, unless the weather changes significantly by the next day. In addition to our immediate response work to help protect and care for children in the very early days, it is likely we will be here at least for 2 years, providing ongoing recovery support, particularly to early education and child care programs, as well as delivering psychosocial and emotional recovery programs to children in the school districts. Based on our prior work in Texas, we have terrific relationships with the child care and early childhood communities. And many people don't realize that most child care programs in the U.S. fall outside of emergency disaster recovery assistance. And so many of these providers will receive zero recovery support. At the same time, these are the services that young children and families who work need most of all in order to get back to work in the very early days and support their own families' recoveries. So again, these services are essential to community economic recovery as well as to the children and families themselves. So that's why SAVE has prioritized child care emergency recovery and pre-K recovery in these large-scale emergencies across the U.S.
I have a question. I have a question from
Sure.
from one of our listeners that I want to bring to your attention. This person says, I understand that the greatest need right now is for financial contributions. We're absolutely focused on that. But as the need grows for supplies, do you recommend that we direct the support to emergency shelters or wait until people have returned to their homes?
I would recommend that you coordinate closely with the nonprofits who are responding. So you can do that through the National VOAD or through Texas VOAD to ensure that your donations are going to get to the right places and meet the correct needs. The one need that everyone says is, please do not mobilize used clothing. Very often in emergencies, you end up with a mountain of used clothing that sits out in a parking lot and it becomes wet or moldy, and that becomes almost a secondary emergency. So a couple of things. Many organizations are putting wish lists, like Save the Children has a wish list for items that we need to support our recovery program. So if you can engage your foundation or your corporation, the organizations that you work with, to try to meet specific needs and then target them for a specific agency, that is really the best way to make effective donations. I know many families, and we've had beautiful donations from kids who want to donate their stuffed animals, or people who sincerely want to make a difference and reach out. But very often, if it doesn't come at the right time and is not provided in the right location, we're not going to be able to really utilize that. So the VOAD networks are really a great way to connect with the nonprofits who are doing the work on the front lines. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you. This is a question from another listener, and this one is to Mike Riedy with FEMA. Can you give me a sense as to what prevents an approximate 10% of applicants not being made whole? My guess it has to do with income. Is that right, Mike?
Hey, Bob, can I answer the other question earlier? That just because I want to add a little bit to what was said.
Yeah, we have to keep them short because we've got a lot of questions to answer.
I'll keep it really short. The other piece that we want to consider when you're thinking about donating some stuff or money to shelters is that we do have a lot of commodities staged in Texas, FEMA, and so if there's a need from the shelters, they can also pull stuff from our staging areas. So we have like 2 million liters of water sitting in staging and another 2 million en route. So to want to donate water is kind of a waste of time, in my opinion, and that money can be used for other things, including the long-term recovery piece. We also have 2 million meals staged and another 2 million meals coming. And so we're also working with, different feeding organizations. And so different things don't necessarily need to support the sheltering, whereas, the long-term recovery piece, and this will wrap into your other question about why is it the 10%? Well, here's the thing. folks are underinsured or don't have insurance, for flood, homeowners insurance doesn't cover a flood event, right? And so many folks their only way of assistance is through FEMA and Small Business Administration, and a lot of folks that are in fixed income, our most vulnerable populations, the elderly and other folks below the poverty line, they're already living paycheck to paycheck, and so now you put a disaster on top of that. They may or may not have had an ability to have flood insurance, and so now they are dealing with the rebuilding of their whole home, whether they're the first floor or their complete house is inundated, and so it's going to take more than the max grant for many of the people to fully recover from this disaster. And not only that, but some folks are living in what's called the special flood hazard area, in the floodplain. And if those folks were built before the flood maps came out, they're going to have a new requirement placed on them to mitigate their home before they can resume living in there. And so some folks may have to elevate, relocate, or do something else to mitigate their home. And so where do you find that additional monies? And so, like I said, that this amount of money that they may get from FEMA, in addition to if they may be eligible for an SBA loan, some won't. So some will apply and be denied as well because they don't qualify due to their credit. So different things, different challenges are typical for that 10% that we talk about. That will be so huge for the community to work with.
Bob, I'd also like to mention, this is Renee. Bob, just a moment.
Yes.
If I could briefly say, Michael didn't address it, but in my experience in the past in disaster recovery, it's also the case that the undocumented likely will not qualify for FEMA assistance unless that has dramatically changed. That is a very large concern in Texas. And so that's something that we know we have heard from donors, and there will be foundations and philanthropy that won't want to address that. But unless those guidelines have changed, that will be a huge need.
Is that something you'll be addressing, Renee, with your foundation? Or
well, typically the way that's been addressed through the local disaster funds is that it's addressed oftentimes through case management that is happening through all of the local agencies that we will be making grants to. And I don't know yet specifically whether there will be a focus on that from specific donors or foundations who want to help with that. But certainly in the greater Houston area, where we have more than 500,000 undocumented people living, that will be a very large need, and the rest of Texas. And I don't know to what degree other agencies are going to be focusing on that, but that's certainly a very important population that is oftentimes already living on the margins.
Do
Bob,
we know
this is
immigration?
Jeanne-Aimee.
Yes, go ahead, Jeanne-Aimee.
Sorry, I was just going to add a story or a quick example so that people on the call can understand what we're talking about. One of the young families that I met in Texas, a mom and dad and two little kids, beautiful blonde little kids. They spent their last penny to put gas in their Suburban in order to drive to the evacuation point. And they've said they live in Rockport. Their mobile home has been completely destroyed. And they told me in tears that they honestly, they're now in San Antonio in this shelter. They honestly don't know what they're going to do. They've lost their home. They've spent their last penny at this point. And, and they've got two beautiful little children that they're trying to care for. So these are the stories we're seeing again and again and again. So it's the undocumented, no question, but there are so many people in America who are on the edge of financial disaster on a good day. And so a storm like this will put so many of them, hardworking, good people, in both groups, hardworking, good people, over the edge. So again, that financial support is critically important now to help get them back on their feet and reestablish lives.
Absolutely.
Renee, another question from listeners. Are there existing long-term recovery groups ready to direct donations, or do they still need to be set up?
No, we're lucky to have had experience in the greater Houston area of responding to many storms in the past. So, the local VOAD is extremely strong here, as are many of our incredible nonprofit agencies. And so we certainly have agencies that will be ready to do long-term recovery. One thing I did want to mention, though, that I think is very important for foundations to be considering is that you really ought to be reaching out to your grantees in the affected areas, because we know that there's many nonprofits themselves that have experienced damage, whether it's been damage to their facilities or whether their staff themselves have been impacted. So it's going to be really important for foundations to be talking to their grantees and really finding out both where they are operationally, what kind of needs that they have, what's happened to their staff. Everything is changing right now. And so I think really being nimble is going to be very important for all of us. But yes, I have great confidence in our nonprofit agencies and the collaborations that have already been established and in the way we've responded to past disasters. So certainly our community will be ready. And there's been great collaboration as well from city and county government. So I know that the agencies will be prepared to do case management, will be prepared to do long-term recovery and rebuilding, but we should also be mindful that the nonprofit sector itself has been impacted, and we need to really be finding out what their needs are.
Hey, this is Mike. Also, long-term recovery groups are at various levels of formation. Some are at the performing stage, and some are going to be now forming because maybe they didn't have the impacts over the last 3 years. And so I'd say over the 18 declared counties and the other 30 plus counties that were impacted as well, there's going to be different levels of capability at the long-term recovery level. And so one of the jobs that I have that I'm blessed with is working with other state and other FEMA valves in working with the locals in developing and bringing up and supporting long-term recovery groups across the state. And so that is one of the missions that we're going to work on in the recovery for the next foreseeable future. And that will probably be months to years that will be supporting that endeavor. So, but yeah, Damian Morales, and the Texas BOAD will be a very strong direct link for that whole piece in terms of supporting the long-term recovery groups. And of course, Renee, you have a very strong connection with the greater Houston area. And so definitely some great things are going to happen, I think, here over the next, I know it's terrible, but a lot of great things will happen hopefully over the next couple of years in the recovery phase.
We've had a number of inquiries about immigrants, and I'm wondering if someone can add a little bit more information. One question was, are any of the immigration detention facilities being impacted by the storm? And then will there be free legal services to the community? Can anyone answer that question?
In regards to legal services for the community, I can respond a little bit on that. I have not yet heard about the immigration detention centers. Michael may know about that. We have a subsidiary of the Greater Houston Community Foundation called the Houston Immigration and Legal Services Collaborative that is coordinating and has been before the storm coordinating, expanding legal representation and capacity for the immigrant community. And so I know that they will continue to attempt to have that function. And so you can reach out to me if you are a funder that is wanting to learn more about that or that needs to get connected to them. I don't know in other parts of the state to what degree there are organizations that will be providing that kind of counsel, and maybe someone else can speak to that.
A question about Save the Children came up, and as we were talking about short-term needs, medium and long-term needs. So what sort of support would Save the Children be looking for now, and what would a donation right now be used for?
So Save, of course, it would always welcome a donation to support. We've set up a specific fund for this, so 100% of the funds donated would be dedicated to this hurricane response. It doesn't go into a general bucket. It is dedicated for this response. The funds would be used to support the deployment of additional staff, the immediate support for children that we're providing in shelters right now already, as well as the expanded work we plan to do in Houston, again, starting either tomorrow or the next day, as soon as we can move our teams into the city, as well as in Dallas. It will then support child care restoration. So we anticipate there are about 4,000 licensed child care programs in the greater Houston area. We anticipate a significant number have been damaged or destroyed. We've had wonderful corporate partners before who have supported this work with us. And so we would love to partner with a foundation or with corporate partners to help get the work done. But I'm anticipating at least 1,000 of child care programs may need some level of recovery support, from replacing outside play equipment to replacing full classrooms, or in some cases the providers may need to relocate to a new area. And so helping getting those new classrooms back up and going. The last thing, sorry, is the psychosocial recovery support. We partnered in the past with the entire Unified School District in Houston, which is one of the largest in the U.S., and we anticipate and hope we'll be able to do the same to bring in our Journey of Hope program to support children and adult caregiver mental health well-being.
Thank you. Thank you. We've got time for 2 more questions, and I want to ask sort of a philosophical question to all of you, and maybe Renee, I'll ask you to kick it off, but it's about the way we're responding to disasters in this country and what we need to do to change it. And I'm going to quote just a little bit from today's Washington Post that said this: "Houston is notoriously flood prone, but no one in the government had planned for a disaster quite like this." And that wasn't meant to be a complaint. They quote Brock Long, from the head of FEMA, as saying, "You could not draw up this forecast. You could not dream this forecast up." Harvey has exposed anew how vulnerable the nation's 4th largest city is to the forces of nature and the failings of infrastructure. And I dare say that's probably true of all major cities, and how natural disasters have a way of revealing the fault lines in governmental operations, and I would say philanthropic ones as well. So I guess I'm asking Renee, what is it that you take away from this disaster? It's still early in responding to it, but if you think about what you would like to do in the future, what comes to mind?
You know, I think the best thing that we can do right now is try to learn as much as we can from the experience. And when we have passed the response mode, which right now we're still really currently focused on response, making sure, I think everyone, all of our government officials, our relief agencies, everyone's trying to make sure that lives are saved. I think when we get past that and we are able to begin to really see the needs of the community, that will be a really wonderful time to step back and look at everything that has happened with our infrastructure, look at the response that we've had, and see what changes need to be made. I'm not in a position personally to have enough perspective on what kind of infrastructure changes would be needed or master disaster plans, because that's just not anything that we in the philanthropic community have been privy to. But I would say that we obviously need to learn from the experience. We need to learn from how our response goes, and we need to recognize too that we're just in unprecedented times in terms of the way weather is changing. So that in itself, I think, for philanthropy is something that ought to be pretty disruptive for all of us, to recognize to have a disaster on this level of scale that may be one of the worst disasters in American history means that something's really fundamentally, I think, changing about our weather patterns. And it's something that we ought to really care about. Beyond that, it's hard to imagine right now exactly what the lessons learned are going to be, but it will be very important to mind them when we get past our immediate focus on recovery and response.
Thank you for that. We've got time for just one more question, and I'd like to kind of go around the table and ask each of you to answer the question, what can those who are listening to this webinar, donors, nonprofits, donors in particular, what can they do to help the work you're doing in Texas right now? What should they be thinking about? I want to just see if Damien's back on the line or not. I suspect he's not. Okay, he doesn't appear to be. So let's start with you, Mike Riedy from FEMA. What should the philanthropic community be thinking about?
Well, so one of the areas that we talk about a lot is that, FEMA, we are restricted by the Stafford Act and what the Code of Federal Regulations tells us we can do. So, we want to do everything we can do to support and help survivors, but we have a lot of red tape we have to go through, and we can't break that. So one of the things that we always are hopeful is that we have a lot more mitigation opportunities, and we have a lot more ways to help people. In the philanthropic community, you do not have the same red tape that we do. You don't answer to Congress in the way that we have to. So you can leverage your funding and also your expertise in bridging gaps and building coalitions that we can't necessarily do on our own. And that's where the philanthropic organizations can really help in building, not only recovering, but recovering better. And that's kind of the message. And for me, it goes back to education and education early. We have to use the 4-H model, where we were having the agricultural change in culture, right? And so what do? They bring the kids in and teach them better ways to do agriculture. And so now they've improved as a society in the way they do ag. And that's the same thing we have to do for what we do, because we are going to continue to go into this pit of disaster costs, because it's so difficult to mitigate and figure out what's the best way to rebuild. And unfortunately, FEMA, we are not the whole picture. We are not the whole community. We can't make this by ourselves. And so the philanthropic community, you can make a huge impact through working with the long-term recovery groups, working with the VOADs and the volunteer partners, and making sure that you are looking at those mitigation opportunities. And sometimes they're not very expensive. Sometimes they're really cheap, but because that family didn't have $3,000 to do a match, they couldn't elevate their home. It's something as simple as that, and sometimes they didn't even know that they should have built that home a little bit higher. It would have only cost them a couple of grand, and now it's going to cost them $15,000 a year for flood insurance because they didn't know the right way to build their home.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for that. Jeanne-Aimee of Save the Children, what's the one thing donors could be thinking about right now?
I think it is obvious there's an immediate need right now. So to make the initial investment and to follow your heart on that. I know this emergency is touching many people in a very heartfelt way. Today's the anniversary of Hurricane Katrina making landfall. So again, it's really front and center on people's mind. I think one of the greatest strengths that the group of people listening in on this call brings is that you really help to lead the direction of philanthropy in this country. And one of the greatest strengths you have all brought is a shift toward investing in collaboration that really leverage results and impact. So I would urge you, obviously, invest in the immediate response, critically important. But then as we look at the longer term recovery, continue to invest in smart partnerships that really deliver results and that build the local capacity. So again, I think that will leave a lasting, it's already shown. Texas sadly will be hit again. The entire Gulf Coast will be hit again, I'm sure. But for each time we invest in building the local capacity as part of all of our response work, we're really getting a better impact. And just one quick example of that, we have partnered with the Child Care Network. Oh, sorry.
We've run out of time. I want to give a moment to Renée Wizig-Barrios from the Greater Houston Community Foundation to have the last word. Renée?
Well, I just want to thank everyone for their interest and for their compassion. And I agree with what all of the other panelists have said. We would appreciate funders being collaborative, and certainly if we can leverage our resources and work together, that's going to be of vital importance. And most importantly, we need to listen to those who've been affected. So I hope we all will work very hard to ensure that people who've been impacted, that their voices are heard and taken into account as we make these decisions, because they really are going to know what's needed to rebuild their communities. And appreciate all of the work that everyone is doing to try to help our community respond.
All right. Well, I want to thank our panelists, Damien, Mike, Renee, and Jeanne-Aimee for their participation today. And we know you're all very, very busy. We want to say thanks to the Council on Foundations and the UPS Foundation for co-hosting this webinar. On the screen, you can see right now some special tools and resources that we have available at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, including a Hurricane Harvey Recovery Fund. So if you've got questions for us, we'd be delighted to hear from you. I just want to give a special thanks today to the CDP team that's been working so nonstop these last few days, especially Anna, Regine, Kathy, and Jasmine. Thank you all very much for your time today. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And